Anyway, we're all ready to go, so let's go ahead and get started. Just a little bit of background. This talk's been evolving over the years. It began initially as a very hardware-focused talk, but since technology's got to the point where now the head-mounted displays are so good, and the software that ships with the head-mounted displays are so integral to the actual device that it's running in, and all the manufacturers just say, like, please, whatever you do, don't touch any of the dials. It's perfect, right? So a lot of the hardware issues are now resolved and taken care of by the manufacturers. So I don't really talk about them anymore because all these problems are largely solved. Instead, I shift my focus to things that you have actual control over, and actually a lot of people kind of struggle with when they're starting VR for the first time. And by the way, for those of you who aren't doing any virtual reality at all, 70% of this talk still relates directly to you because it is optimization, optimization, optimization. Because the vast majority of the problems that surround virtual reality has to do with frame rate. So this talk has something for everybody. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So, most developers in virtual reality approach this emerging medium through the lens of video games that have been dominant in the modern era of interactive entertainment. Intellectually, we know this approach is fraught with peril, yet we are either unaware of the many known best practices or unable to invest the time and resources to develop a language and share an understanding of the techniques for VR development. So in this talk, I will share what I've learned in my 25 years of video game development, including the lessons I've learned in the last 4 years of research and development at DreamWorks and at Spaces. So, about myself, I've been developing for over 25 years, creating interactive entertainment for VR, console, social, and mobile platforms. Managed multiple and internal and external development teams, setting core technical standards in a variety of areas, mostly throughout the art and character pipeline. I've shipped more than 17.5 million titles, earning over $500 million in cooperation with Warner Brothers, Nickelodeon, and Disney Pixar. I've served as an adjunct professor for the last 6 years at USC, and most importantly, I'm a gamer. I love games. Absolutely adore games. I love board games, video games, you name it. And I'm particularly lucky to make my living doing interactive entertainment. I have recently fallen in love with VR. The VR community is a very small, tight-knit group of talented artists, designers, and engineers. And we are so close to the nascence of the modern era of VR that I can say with confidence that there's really only about 1,000 people on the planet right now who are truly making great VR. While I specialize in a few areas of art, namely character environment, game design, and UI, I have served across a broad range of disciplines which assisted my growth as founder, executive producer, artistic director, and educator. And most recently, I've spent 4 years at the Dream Lab division of DreamWorks and at Spaces as a researcher, designer, and artistic director for VR products that include AR, MXR, VR, for mobile consoles, and for amusement park rides. So, what's virtual reality? So, technically speaking, the term is used to describe a three-dimensional computer-generated environment which can be explored and interacted by one or more persons. I'd like to quote Michael Abrash regarding the presence. Quote, "It's a sense of being someplace else while in virtual reality. Many people feel as though they've been teleported. Presence is an incredibly powerful sensation, and it is unique to VR. There's no way to create it in any other medium. And most people find it to be a kind of magical experience, and we think that once people have experienced presence, they'll want it very badly." So, you know that you've nailed plausibility when your guests exhibit involuntary reactions and express true joy or true fear in your virtual experience. So this is, of course, what we aspire to. We aspire to create incredible visceral reactions in our experiences. Now, the quality of VR is typically described as immersion, which can be loosely defined as when a player becomes so physically, emotionally, and mentally invested in the experience to a degree that they lose connectivity to the real world. Objectively, there are two qualifying components to creating effective virtual reality. The first is the illusion of presence. There are four key components to this. One is tactical. Tactile immersion is experienced when performing tactile operations that involve skill, such as when players feel in the zone and when they're perfecting actions that result in success. Athletes largely feel tactile immersion. There is strategic immersion, which is more cerebral. It's associated with mental challenges. Chess players feel cerebral immersion when they are deep in a game of chess. They think 7 moves ahead, and they can see the board evolving in their mind. This is strategic immersion. Then there is also narrative immersion, which occurs when players become invested in a story, and it's similar to what you experience when you're so embedded in a book that you can't even sense the world around you. And finally, spatial immersion, which occurs when the player feels that the world is perceivably convincing. That people that experience this kind of immersion feels as if they were there. And when they look back on the experiences that they experience, they think of it in the same way that you remember a vacation that you once went on, rather than something that they read. Next is the illusion of plausibility, which is the sum of all the elements of presence. It's based on the evidence of many, many experiences, and it appears that a key component of plausibility illusion is the events in the virtual environment over which you have no direct control of refer directly to you. So an important component leading to plausibility illusion is for the virtual reality to provide a correlation between external events not directly caused by the participant and their own sensations. And so we refer to these as exoreceptive and interoceptive phenomena. Okay, so exoreceptive refers to stimuli that you can control, and interoceptive is stimuli that you can't control. An example is of exoreceptive stimulus is when someone, you pass by someone in an environment and it's like, hey, I'm talking to you. So you didn't cause that, they caused that, but they get your attention and they're like, what, me? When you react to that kind of stimulus, it deepens your immersion and it increases the level of plausibility in the experience. Whereas interoceptive is something that you do. So for example, the very first thing you do in an environment is and especially if it's walk around, you go over and you start whacking stuff to see if you can get it to react to your emotions. If it's Elder Scrolls, just go up and start talking to people to see how well they respond to you. So anything that you initiate, whether it's physical, whether it is social, anything that you do to react to your environment, if the environment then reacts back to you, that is a successful interaction from an interoceptive source. The single most vital component to immersion is to design your gameplay in such a way that you do not violate your audience. So, in that sense, remember that the game is not a camera. The game is your audience, and your audience is inside your environment. You have to respect your audience member and make sure that you are not breaking presence by breaking the rules of immersion. So immersion is certainly key. As a result, performance issues are the #1 barrier to immersion, because if you obstruct the ability to have a comfortable experience by causing disorientation, nausea, etc., immersion is broken. You cannot hold immersion while forcing a horrible experience on your audience member. So our goal as creators is to design something that is immersive, fun, and engaging. And the obstacles to achieving this goal are both creative, technical, since disorientation, nausea, eye strain, all block and create obstacles to fully engaging our audience. And no matter how innovative, clever your design is, no matter how thoughtful and engaging it is, it's all going to be lost if your audience is having a disruptive experience. Because comfort and visual fidelity constitute the largest risk towards derailing immersion, we begin by examining sim sickness and understanding the vestibular system. Simulation sickness is more acute in VR. Since external reference points are blocked from your vision, you have no way to understand where you are in relation to your horizon and to your orientation. Studies have shown that rotational motions, and especially acceleration and deceleration in VR, significantly increase nausea and other symptoms of motion sickness. So, the keys to solving sim sickness is to eliminate the source, which is incongruences between your simulation and the effects on the vestibular system. Now, the vestibular system is a sensory system that provides leading contribution to your sense of balance and spatial orientation for the purpose of coordinating movement with balance. And while we understand that it is directly responsible for sim sickness, the actual mechanism for nausea is not clearly understood. Although the most widely accepted theory for what causes the nausea is that it is a reaction by the incorrect perception that there is a neurotoxin in your body. The idea being that, I'm disoriented and experiencing double vision and I'm falling over. I must be poisoned. Okay, let's induce the volume. And then, I feel much better now. Cool. So, we don't have evidence for this, but it's the most widely accepted belief. It certainly explains the connectivity between nausea and disorientation. So, but getting back to the point, because visual and physical feedback directly affects the vestibular system, it therefore becomes the primary lever that we have to ensuring complete and total comfort for our guests. So anything that can possibly affect the vestibular system therefore becomes the thing that we most critically have to fix. Let's talk about the next largest obstacle to immersion. That is what we perceive. Now, this has largely been solved by the head-mounted display manufacturers. It largely revolves around two things: latency and around rendering. Now, latency is with latency, it effectively is defined as what happens from the moment you turn your head to the point where your CPU calculates the change in orientation, fixes the render buffer, and splits an image back into eyeballs. When that last image is, from the moment you start turning your head to the moment that last image has been rendered on screen, that is the measurement of latency. And we've got to the point now where we can get that down to about 20 milliseconds. 20 milliseconds is exceptionally good latency, and that constitutes a good, comfortable experience. 5 milliseconds is ideal. And we now have experiences that can hit 5 milliseconds, which is pretty amazing. But we largely don't have control over, yes?
Is that the new Oculus? Like the Oculus Go, or isn't there a new Oculus that's being released?
Oculus hits about 5 milliseconds, and this is largely not because of the speed of the hardware, because it's still, it is actually still a tethered experience, but it's because of the time warp software. The time warp software actually calculates and anticipates the speed that you are moving your head through space, and says, oh, we calculate that your head's going to be in this location in the future, and actually it will change the render buffer to accommodate that calculation. So it's a cheat, but it works. It turns out that mobile VR has a much better latency. The reason why is because The tethered display has an accelerometer located in the head-mounted display. Says, oh, I've changed location. Sends the information down a massively long cable to your CPU, does the calculations, and spits it back up the massively long cable to your HMD, right? That's a colossal waste of time. Your smartphone does a much better job because the CPU and GPU interact directly with the accelerometer. So there's literally no distance. And so it just goes right back. And for a very, very, very small experience, can do the calculation very, very quickly. Now, it doesn't have the benefit of a giant beefy computer. And so for experiences that are driven by, say, Unreal, your mobile device is not going to be able to do it. But for a very minimal experience that is largely garrote shaded, it is actually better than a tethered HMD. So, blah, blah, blah. So that's latency. Rendering. Now, rendering is largely installed. You actually do have levers in your software development kit. Unless it's core to your business, try not to touch them. Effectively, the way what happens is the surface area of your head-mounted display is much, much, much more narrow than the actual range of our peripheral vision. So what happens is the lenses do two things. One, it brings the content into focus, and it also condenses the angle of display. So that over a very, very narrow display, you actually get a very, very broad angle of view. In order to do this, though, it creates what is called a pincushion. Basically, there's a pincushion contraction that happens. I'm sorry, hang on a second. Time for me to. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Go back. Distortion. Thank you. The pincushion distortion is caused by the lens, and then there's a software solution for a barrel distortion that recorrects for this, so that effectively what happens is you have a very, very tiny display, but it looks large, should have perfectly vertical and horizontal lines, because first the lens creates the pincushion distortion, and then the shader will recorrect for that, and then you get nice straight lines. We don't have to worry about this, but be aware of it, particularly if you're doing any post-processing effects, because you're going to have to apply a barrel distortion to any post-process effect that you cast onto your regular frustum. So the next boundary to creating immersion is respecting the avatar. Now, as I mentioned before, the avatar is not a camera, it's your guest. Do not fall into the trap of cinematic action genre camera techniques. Avoid zooms, avoid flying camera, flying your camera along a spline. You know those great shots where the cameraman is following a guy in the back of a motorcycle, and he ducks underneath a semi-truck as the truck is exploding, and basically gets away with the diamonds. It's cool, right? Would you take your grandmother and throw her under the truck? No, you wouldn't. By the way, if you are experiencing VR, you're on the back of that motorcycle. Don't do that to your guests. It's really, really disorienting. Now, you can do an interstitial endpoint, which actually works really, really, really well for third-person avatars. And basically, to explain this, who's got a Sharpie they can throw at me? Thanks, photos. Thank you. So basically, the way it works is if you have your avatar zipping around in the scene, and you've got your camera that is following, what you want to do is you actually want to have from the point of the camera and from the point of your avatar, you want to have another point that actually averages them. So if your camera is going in this direction and your avatar is moving in this direction, what's going to happen is from these 2 points, the camera is going to try to try to find the mean between them. So what happens is that at any one point, even if your avatar is zipping around, your camera is not going to follow your avatar directly, because that's going to cause camera jitter. But rather, it's going to follow the interstitial point between your avatar and the camera. And what that does is that actually has sort of like a smoothing effect. It's sort of like it's the same technique that's used with the lazy brush. Does that make sense? So so if any of you that are creating in-game cameras for third-person, either third-person experiences or for VR, you can use this as a smoothing technique, and it works really, really well. For first-person VR experiences, the ground horizon is a critical component to VR space. It ensures stability and the comfort of the user. You want to avoid rotating world space and doing kind of janky camera angles, like French angles, and anything that might be construed as artistic. It may be an excellent aesthetic choice, but it's a horrible choice for VR, because it is only going to lead to discomfort, disorientation, and it's a one-way ticket to Vomit Town, so don't do it. And it's very, very difficult to keep your audience captured when they are bending over the sink. Not a good idea. Yes? If that's your aim, and actually, no, this is something that's really kind of, I was actually going to mention to you, because anytime the monster is close, what you can do is you can oscillate your camera. Yeah, and you know what's going to happen? That creepy, sickening feeling is just going to appear out of nowhere, like magic, and no one's going to know why. It's like, oh, my hairs are standing on end in the back of my neck, and I feel like sick to my stomach. Why? The monster's close. And also because the engineer is oscillating.
So where's the line between violating your, basically using those sort of tools to elicit a response from the player versus making them sick?
The line is that if you can elicit the response without completely losing your audience, huzzah. And it is subjective. But at the end of the day, you're trying to create an experience, and you want an overall positive outcome from that experience. If you're overly successful with your nausea-inducing camera trick, then you have to dial it back. And by the way, the best practice is test, test, test. You want to get lots and lots and lots of users. And by the way, you, the developer, is the worst possible person to test your VR experiences, because you, my friends, you're broken. You've had way too many hours in VR. You are broken. You have to test on somebody who does not spend all their time in virtual reality. They are your canary in the coal mine. For all intents and purposes, we're in the coal mine, and we basically have like stuffy noses. We can't smell the gas. You need a canary. Now, funny story. We had someone over at DreamWorks that we actually called the canary. This was someone who would get violently carsick and had basically just horrible motion sickness and a tremendous fear of heights. Yet strangely, this individual also loved virtual reality and loved the bleeding edge. And she basically said, hey, guys, anytime you have something, I want to see it. And what we would do is, but we were respectful of her. We waited until we hit 99th percentile. We never tested on 90. When we had 100% no visceral reaction, that's when we called her. We're like, I don't know, man, we're hitting 100%. There's got to be something wrong. So we called her, I'm like, okay, we got something for you to try. She'd come over, and we knew that we nailed it when we actually had an experience where she was just like walking around going, oh, this is great. And then she jumped out of VR, and she's like, no, I don't feel sick at all. I'm like, yes. So, I don't know who y'all canaries are, but gotta get one. It's almost as important as having an industry advisor. Also ensure that your experience has a one-to-one correlation between the user-specific anatomy. Head and hand calibration is highly recommended. to ensure positional tracking is as accurate as possible. This can be done on the welcome screen of your experience. You can basically have a moment when you say, stare at the dot, and click OK. Put your hands out to your sides and click OK. Right? And then we'll know exactly how tall you are and what your wingspan is. And this is really, really important for making sure that you get that one-to-one correlation. Remember, this is VR. Anytime there's a disconnect, you're going to break immersion. And we go through great pains at spaces to make sure that we can hit that one-to-one correlation. So that when you are on a jet ski, we actually put you on we put you on an actual, like, practical that is exactly a jet ski. We want to have the same exact swivel on the handlebars. We want the seat to feel the same. We want the angle of your posture to be identical to when you're on a jet ski. So it's very, very, very important to make sure that you create as many opportunities for that visceral engagement as possible. So I would actually recommend, especially for your guys' team, with the handheld controller, think about actually getting some like leather welding gloves, and taping your hand controllers to the leather welding gloves, so that they feel as though you're in some sort of an underwater suit. So like when you don those gloves, you're like, oh yeah. And then when you put the HMD on, and then put a helmet on. Put an actual helmet on. Why not? How cool would that be? It'll make for a great Facebook post. Hi, Mom, I'm in a stupid experience. All right, and then finally for third-person content, the player still identifies with the camera. The camera is still an avatar. It's amazing. Even though you have an unbodied experience and all the action's happening, and your head is like 3 stories up, and you're looking at all the action going down on the ground, it has a miniaturizing effect. And it actually makes the avatar, the user, feel like you're 3 stories high. And it's incredibly powerful, but you also have to respect the camera, even at that height of 3 stories. So make sure that the action happens mostly in front, that there's no large degrees of pivot. Don't put any of the action behind. If the user has to do this all the time, it's uncomfortable, so don't do it. For the most part, you also want to make sure that your guest is probably going to be sitting on the couch. So consider that they're sitting on a couch, and don't make someone look behind the couch. It's a big pain in the butt. If it's a standing experience, make sure that that there's nothing that's going to interfere with the user. So try to keep things out of the proximity of the head. And if you do have to interpenetrate with any of the objects, it's actually better to have them fade away and be visible as your head passes through, than for the user to actually either lock the camera, which will cause a disconnect and hurl, or it's better than to actually have them interpenetrate and see, the weird intersected guts of the model of the building, or worse, a player character. Because how many people have actually stuck their head inside of a player character model with like the teeth and the tongue and the eyeballs floating? It's gross. You literally put your head inside of someone else's head. You see 2 eyeballs floating there. It's disgusting. So better to have them just fade away to nothing. I mean, that's weird, but it's better than seeing floating eyeballs, over a mouth cavity. Okay. Now, as far as the did I already do? Hang on a second. Bip. All right, so I found a bug in my notes. Third-person avatar, that was on that page, viewpoint. Okay, here we are. So the ground and horizon are also critical components. You want to ensure stability and comfort for the user. Avoid rotating world space. And also consider the degree of freedom that your user has, as well as the likely angles. This largely has to do with user interfaces, which I will actually be discussing in a future slide. So actually what I'll do is I will advance to user interfaces. But it's worth noting that for the most part, your focal arc is 30 degrees in either direction, 30 degrees straight down, 25 degrees straight up. So largely it is a 60-degree cone. That's where your focal point is. If you now the Sunburst team already knows this because we've chatted about this, but never slap a UI directly onto someone's face, which might obstruct their vision. It's incredibly disorienting. They do have a head-up display, but the way they're doing is that it's actually locked in world space, and it is outside of that 60-degree cone. It's just at the peripheral edges of that screen space. So it's comfortable. It feels just like a head-up display on an F16 or just out of the peripheral vision for a race car. And that's where you want it. And you also want it to be light. You don't want it to be heavy and opaque to the point that it obstructs your view. You want it to be incredibly light, with a very, very light font and a very, very light wire, sort of like wire display. That's the most, that's the best possible choice you can make because it won't interfere with the rest of the world space. Movement's one of the most difficult things to get right in virtual reality. The reason why is because you're in limited space. Even in a walk-around experience, you're practically limited to about anywhere from 10 by 10 to 20 by 20. Oculus only supports a standing VR experience where you have a degree of freedom that is somewhere in the vicinity of about a meter, no more than 2 meters. Any more than that, and you start to lose camera tracking because they only have 2 points of tracking available. Whereas HTC Vive has a lighthouse that can track the entire room. So it makes it very, very difficult because a lot of the games that we're used to have a lot of movement, a lot of action, and walking just doesn't work because you can't walk to one side of the room, turn around, and start walking back. It feels dumb. By the way, it also looks dumb. So, but one solution that is really fascinating is a solution that the folks over at the Void came up with, and that is using redirection. We've had many folks right here at USC that have done studies with redirection and had exhibits on display at SIGGRAPH. And redirection's been around for many, many years. Effectively, what it does is it creates a slight shift in the world environment as you move through space. And what happens is that your brain assumes, oh, I must be slightly off course. And you involuntarily will start making slight right turns, even though you think you're walking in a straight line. And eventually, you will have found that you have been directed to walk in a complete 180-degree arc. And those arcs can be as short as they can happen in space as small as 30 feet across. It's kind of amazing. Now, this is a good technique for redirecting in a large arena-scale environment. But for consumer-grade VR, it just doesn't work. So, what are the best practices? Teleportation is probably the best mode of mobility in a VR experience for fast, action-paced experiences. But it has to make sense. It absolutely has to make sense. If you're doing Alice in Wonderland and you're doing teleportation, that could kind of work. Particularly if you're using like little clouds of smoke or potions. The fiction works. If it's science fiction, it clearly works. But it's definitely not going to work if you are doing sort of like a CSI investigation experience, because why the heck are you teleporting, detective? That just doesn't make sense. So teleportation is not right for every experience. You do want to think about the fiction because the fiction is part of the immersion. If you do decide to do teleportation, make sure that you give lots and lots of feedback. You want to make sure that you're clearly displaying the arc that the player is going to take, as well as displaying the landing area. Because one of the problems with teleportation is that if there's no user feedback, then it can be very, very disorienting when you arrive. You almost have to get to the point where you're really, really good at it. You have to like level up and get like all my crawler. And then you can teleport with these. But when you're first starting out teleporting, it's really disorienting. The UI definitely helps. And then what you can do, of course, is as a good game designer, you can make the UI optional. You can turn it on, turn it off. Or you can make it minimal. You can make it basically a very, very minimal landing space for players who are expert teleporters. You also want to avoid acceleration. This is one of the single biggest problems that I see in experiences that I try out. Acceleration always hits the vestibular system. Even when you're just sort of like shifting your weight from side to side, there's an acceleration going on. And your vestibular system is so good, it can sense it. Just this shift. That is accelerate, decelerate. Accelerate, decelerate. Even if you're bobbing up and down, there's an acceleration, deceleration, acceleration, deceleration. That bobbing will like make you hurl. And you would not believe how subtle you can actually make it, which is why I mentioned the camera. It is far better to do strictly linear movements, and that is an immediate acceleration, a zero acceleration. Basically, you just ramp from 0 speed, poof, straight to top speed, poof, back down to no speed at all. If you actually must accelerate, make it fast. Do a fast acceleration and then a fast deceleration. And even though it's jarring, I do highly recommend no acceleration. It may break plausibility, but it's better than breaking the vestibular system. For those of you who know your physics, going around the curve is also an acceleration. So even if I'm traveling in a vehicle on a rail, and it's a constant motion, the minute I go around the curve, that's an acceleration. Don't do it. It's far better to do sharp turns, sharp angular turns, with instant reorientation, which is jarring, but it's still better than a curve. If you absolutely must go around the curve to avoid any kind of a hiccup, make that curve really, really tight. And hopefully the fiction of your game will accommodate for you. All mobility should be controlled by the avatar whenever possible. You want to avoid any mechanic that takes movement away from your avatar, such as camera shakes, bobbing. Camera shakes are great in fight scenes on the big picture, especially if your actor can't fight. By the way, it drives me nuts. It drives me absolutely nuts. Whenever there's a camera shake, it's like, well, I came here to see Batman, but for all intents and purposes, it's some stuntman shaking over there. I don't know. It's pet peeve. Anyway, avoid. Never, ever, ever, ever take control away from the avatar. And if you do, make sure there's a fiction that the user can understand. Hey, you're about to get on the train. Push the button to get the train to lurch forward. And then the user punches the button and the train lurches forward. Now, the difference between a voice saying the train's about to start and the train just goes versus a user hitting a button is that that's part of the interoceptive system. Because the user hit a button and there was a reaction, it actually reduces the stress in the vestibular system. So always make sure that there's sort of an action-reaction whenever you're about to do something to the user. And notice how I said, before you do something in the game, I said before you do something to the user, because that's effectively what you're doing. Oh, occlusion. So another great trick is a cockpit experience, because whenever you're able to occlude a lot of the stimulus, particularly as it relates to what's going on the horizon, it's always much better. So two things. One, always make sure to include a horizon in your experience. Even if you're deep in the woods, if you're deep in the woods and the sky is pitch black, that's more disorienting than when you're deep in the woods and you can see the stars. And the reason why is because as you're translating through that forest, the stars will always seem motionless, and that will ground and help your user to feel a little bit more settled. It's always important to have some kind of a distant, immovable skyline. Conversely, that also works to your advantage when you are in a vehicle and you have a vehicle with really, really small windows, far more comfortable than something that has large windows. The reason why is because when you occlude vision to the background that's racing past you, you feel grounded in the cabin of a vehicle. Vehicles in our day and age feel very familiar, and it has a very, very comforting effect. And even when you have a vehicle with, if you must have a vehicle with large windows, you can reduce the nausea by making sure that you have a very, very large sky dome that takes up the vast majority of the scene. It also has the same grounding effect for a vehicle. Oh, lastly, with movement, make sure that any kind of movement that you're doing has a real-world correlation. When you have someone running in a straight linear path at 60 miles an hour, it's far more unsettling than if you have them running at 15 miles an hour. And the reason why is because we're all familiar with the velocity of running 15 miles per hour. 60 miles per hour is unnatural. But by the way, interestingly, it goes away if the person's in a car. If you actually have a vehicle surrounding the camera and you're going 60 miles an hour in a straight line, suddenly the nausea goes away. And it's all because of what our brain has come to expect. And what our brain expects has as much to do with hitting the vestibular system as physics. So we've already talked about freedom of vision and menus for user interfaces as it relates to making sure that they are actually grounded in world space. There's no excuse not to ground a menu in world space in virtual reality, because we're surrounded with user interfaces in our world. Look, we have a dial. I've got buttons. I've got a lever. I've got buttons on the back of this TV. Got a big giant red button on this power strip. We're surrounded with UI elements. So in virtual reality, put your UI in workspace. That's where it belongs. If you're going to have any kind of display of text in your virtual environment, you want to take advantage of things that we already know and have been proven by the TV industry for many, many years, which is the most comfortable viewing distance is between 1 and 3 meters. If you're going to have a large display, make it a curved display so that instead of starting off with the left hand of the sentence far away, getting closer to you in the middle of the sentence, and then going far away with the right hand of the sentence, which would occur if it was on a flat display, make it a curved display. That way, your eyes don't have to refocus as you're reading the text. Make sure that if you have text that's too small to read, one really neat trick that I've seen that is surprisingly effective is instant magnification. There's, in the IKEA app, there are pages of the IKEA catalog that are on the table. And what happens is that if you kind of like bend down and take a closer look, the page grows to about 3 times the size, and all the text is completely legible. It's unnatural and weird, but it works. So there's all sorts of interesting things that you can do to overcome the fact that you're trying to display a lot of information across a 1080p display over each eye. How are we doing on time? Oh, way over. All right. No surprises. So what follows next are optimization basics. And these optimization basics are things that you all should know, regardless of whether you're making a VR experience or not. And in the interest of time, what I'll do is I'll run through these very, very quickly, and I'll stop at each slide and ask anyone to raise their hand if they want any further explanation. When I talk about optimization, we're basically talking about hitting our goal of 90 frames per second. Any less than 90 frames per second, and you're going to create a disconnect that is very, very unsettling in VR. You absolutely have to have completely smooth camera tracking. Otherwise, your vestibular system is going to perceive those translations as a camera judder. Not good. And by the way, I would happily sacrifice fidelity of my objects in order to hit camera, my frame rate every single time. It's that important. So for geometry, obviously you want to remove any faces that are necessary. There's many, many ways to reduce your geometry calls. You can use overdraw. Overdraw is a display that a display setting where you can check to see what objects are being rendered more than once in your scene. If they are being rendered more than once, then you can use some occlusion techniques to reduce that. You also want to take advantage of draw call batching. Draw call batching is a technique by which, rather than rendering multiple objects and sending a draw call to render each object, all the vertices are batched, are basically momentarily culled into one object, rendered, and then thrown away. And it is surprisingly faster to do that than to send a draw call to your GPU each time. There's two types of batching. Dynamic batching transforms the verts into one giant group and renders them all together. Static batching will combine all game objects into one big mesh and then write it to your memory. So static batching is memory intensive. Dynamic batching is CPU intensive. And figuring out which one to use is kind of a rock, paper, scissors. You've got to figure it out. Make sure that you're taking advantage of light mapping whenever possible. It will bake your scenes down to make them as beautiful as they ought to be. Avoid using dynamic lights. Dynamic lights are incredibly CPU intensive. Some packages such as Unity have light probes and reflection probes. Take advantage of them. They're really great for making all sorts of calculations that resemble the same sorts of results that you would get from dynamic lights without actually doing any dynamic light calculations in real time. Reflection probes will cache an instantiated heat map of your scene to a cache that can be used to render back onto nice shiny objects. If you're actually calculating reflections in real time, it's a massive hit on your CPU, so try not to do it. You can also use occlusion culling. Occlusion culling will cull anything that is being blocked by another object. It is tricky to optimize your scene so that you have assets that are both occludable and are also using shared texture palettes. But it can be done with practice. Asynchronous loading is if you try every trick in the book and you still can't get your scenes to run at frame rate, you can divide your scene in half. And then load the section that your player is in, and then load the second half of your scene only when you need it. I've had many, many scenes in the past where we couldn't hit frame rate, and we divided them up into 3 or 4 chunks and connected them by little snaking corridors, so that as one is being loaded out of memory and you're inside the corridor, another one's being loaded into memory. It's a trick that's been around since the 90s and it still works today. There's also LODs, level of detail. A lot of, every package supports it. Generating the LODs, there are now automated tools that will automatically create the LODs for you, such as Simply Gone, and other tools for any kind of poly reducing tool you have. Maya has a built-in poly reducing tool. It's not that great. My favorite poly reducing tool is made by Intangio. But you want to make sure that you are using LODs whenever possible to limit the number of polygons that you're rendering at any time. For your materials, you want to make sure that you're using texture atlases whenever possible. If every single object has its own native texture map, that means that if you have a scene with 1,000 objects, you have 1,000 draw calls, and that's horrible. Especially when you have the ability to have all of your objects share the exact same material. There was, who played the VR Adventure Time? Anybody? Who was a fan of Adventure Time? Yay, okay, cool. So they did Adventure Time for Gear VR. Any given scene in that thing only had about 14 draw calls per scene. They were hitting like something crazy, like they were hitting 120 frames per second on most scenes. And they just optimized it. And this is on a Galaxy 4, a Galaxy Note 4. It was just a beauty of an optimized game. Largely thanks to texture atlasing. Meshmaker is a great tool for this. There's also texture atlasing tools that date back to the mid-90s that you can get at Creative Crash if you are a Maya user. Please note that normal maps generally don't look good in VR, so avoid them unless you have something with really kind of a high amount of detail. It generally doesn't really move the needle much, but it can help. When appropriate, use the most basic shaders. You want to use mobile shaders whenever possible. And avoid full screen effects. Full screen effects can be often disastrous because they're designed for single screens, they're not designed for stereo vision. If you actually have a full screen effect, you then have to actually hack it and write your own shader so that you're rendering the full screen effect stereoscopically correct for both eyes. For your quality settings, check your quality settings to make sure that your anti-aliasing is optimized. Anti-aliasing is a great way to make sure that your stuff looks fantastic. And the settings are typically adjustable. You also want to make sure that you are adjusting your render scale. Render scale allows you to trade sharpness for performance. And you can reduce the quality of the scale for each camera cache. It will, if you're not hitting frame rate, you can always reduce render scale to make up the difference. It's a last-ditch effort, but do take a look at it. So, what does this all mean for our industry? Arguably, VR has finally arrived. We now have major companies that have invested incredible percentages of their research and development with the expectation that VR is really going to hockey stick. This is probably going to happen right about, my educated guess is it's going to start really happening in 2018. It's not going to happen this year, kids. It's not going to happen next year. We are still in the phase of early adoption, but by 2018, it's going to be a thing. I argue that by 2020, VR will have taken over console game sales. I do think this is true. But undeniably, it's going to be a thing. I have two different sources that put revenue at about $4 billion by 2020. But $4 billion by 2018. There's another source that puts revenue at $120 billion by 2022. 120 billion. It's crazy. And Facebook bet the farm that virtual reality was going to become a thing. $2 billion. I think that largely they're correct. But in the near future, I think that the winners are going to be mobile VR. And mobile VR for a number of reasons. Number one, It has low latency. It has the advantage of no tethers. It also has direct connectivity to app stores, but most importantly, it has direct social connectivity. Everybody on your smartphone is accessible to an app. All you have to do is say, hey, this app would like to have permission to look at all the stuff that's on your smartphone. And you say, yeah. So boom, instantly, you're twitching all your stuff to your friends, sharing all of your achievements, sharing experiences that you can post immediately to Facebook. The connectivity is instantaneous. And I think that much more than consoles, smartphones are better prepared to deal with our socially connected world than any other medium. So, in closing, virtual reality is here, ready or not. And the argument for ready is a lot stronger than not. But readiness and function, readiness is a function of understanding how the medium is capturing the imagination of developers. So I would argue that for those of you who have any interest in virtual reality, get to know the medium intimately because it is the future. Shameless plug. Our showcase is going to be this December 7th. So mark it in your calendar, tell all your friends. It's a thing. It is the thing. And if your friends don't already know about it, what the heck, guys? Exactly. And that does it for best practices in VR. Are there any questions? Yes?
So, the first time I played a console like heavily was when I was a little bit older. I know most people did that earlier, and like the learning curve for a modern gaming controller was still, a couple of hours for me. Using VR in our project, I feel like, like you said, we're the worst testers now because we're broken. Will we get to a point where the consumers have mass adopted VR to where the development cycle for people who make VR will change because we aren't worrying about people getting nauseous because, it's still a factor, but
right.
Everyone's already broken in,
right.
basically.
That's a great question. I believe that sim sickness is always going to be I think it's always going to be a risk. Because it's just too easy. It's too easy to make a horrible experience. And what's going to happen is that as companies mature, there's just simply going to be no tolerance for it. You would not, just as there's no tolerance for a CG movie that looks like your nephew made it. Seriously, if a CG movie looks like your nephew made it, you walk out of the movie, and no one's going to make any money. So people that don't have an understanding of the best practices and create experiences that cause sim sickness, they're just not going to find work. And their products are just not going to be bought. Now that said, there will always be people who are going to be far more broken. Just as there are people that know the back of their gamepad like there's no tomorrow. Up, down, left, right, A, B, slap, right? Everyone, you can just do it in your sleep, right? So those sort of motor skills and like people, there's a whole generation of people that know how to play a guitar that operates with 5 buttons. There's no instrument like that, and yet they've dedicated like a whole massive quantity of gray matter to the mastery of this instrument.
There could be a guitar like that. We should probably get the students in groups and go on there. We have a visitor today. We have Gina Ramirez from the Agency for the Performing Arts. She just founded the Games